Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first episode of Saints and Sages. This is going to be awesome. Don't worry at all. I may or may not know what I am doing, but I'm confident my co-hosts know what they're doing. We're going to introduce ourselves loosely. We don't want to take too much time, but there'll be some sort of preface on this, but we will get into our topic of discussion for today, which is Saint Edmund the Martyr. And this video is coming out on his feast day, at least the feast day on a certain calendar for him. But I'll begin. My name is Shannon Sheeran. I'm from Illinois. I live in Illinois. I only moved back about a year ago. And I am a master's student in philosophy. I should actually be finishing this month my program. I just go to an online Catholic school, and I'm hoping to begin studies on another master's degree in sacred scripture from the same school. And as far as religion goes, since we're talking about relatively religious topics, I am a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or commonly referred to as a Mormon. You can call me a Mormon. I don't care. But yeah. Liam.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm Liam. I'm Shannon's brother, even though we have a different last name. And I'm also from Illinois, surprise. I currently live in Idaho. It's beautiful. I'm near the Tetons and Yellowstone. I am also in a master's program. I am essentially a medievalist. I study philology, Germanic philology. And and my particular interest is English, so Middle English, Old English. So stuff like Edmund kind of comes into the picture often enough for me. Yeah, I'm also a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
And I'm Sean. I'm from Massachusetts, where my family has been since the 1600s. I am also a medievalist. I study the early medieval period, particularly the Viking Age and the related areas. I am currently working on a graduate diploma in Germanic philology, focusing on Old Norse. And I am an Orthodox Christian in the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia.
Yeah.
If you study Vikings, are you the enemy of Edmund? No. That's an interesting topic. We'll get to that. Anyways.
Yeah, we will get to that. Just, I guess, a little bit more preface. Thank you, Liam, and thank you, Sean. Liam is my brother. We've known Sean for actually not all that long. I don't even think it's been 2 years yet, but it feels like it's been longer than that. He is our good friend of faith. And this channel is this podcast is largely being produced because we feel like there is a need for more good content. I mean, lots of people listen to educational content that should be educational in many ways. But not all educational content teaches one to be moral, or at least to be more like Christ. And at least by a study of the saints, we hope that we can learn to be more like our Savior, pretty much. And especially, I've talked to some of the students that in the program that I'm in, and I've talked to Sean a little bit about this. And I've sometimes thought it might be a little odd that as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, where we have the term saints even in the church's official name, we don't talk too much about saints in our church. And I've gone over how I think that's largely because I think most members might think that it takes away from the Savior. And I could understand their concerns. But I still think that learning about these historical figures of a saintly character in many ways represent Christ well and have this Christ-like nature, I think we can not only learn to love these historical figures from different eras and cultures that are different than our own, we can learn to love our Savior more as well and to be more like him. And so I think it's a worthwhile pursuit. We don't need to study just people of our own faith tradition either. I think there's a lot of good in the world, outside the LDS Church, outside the Orthodox Church, outside the Catholic Church, whatever church, any tradition really, not even Christian necessarily. So today we're going to go over St. Edmund, and there might be a theme or trend, with most of our videos, and that might be that Sean and Liam know what they're talking about more than I do. But they graciously allowed for me to be on here because this was my idea. And that is going to at least be the trend starting today, because Liam and Sean are a bit more equipped to talk on St. Edmund the Martyr than I am. So for at least the time being, I'm going to give it away to them.
Well, first off, I wanted to say that I mean, Edmund is a great first saint. I think, funnily enough, we're actually past his feast day on the Gregorian calendar.
The
but
correct one.
the correct one. But in the Julian calendar, we're not. So also, and I would say actually that's a similar thing that started me on another project. Not to advertise myself immediately, but I run another project called the Alfred Homily Project, and that is where every month I translate a homily from Alfred, who is a monk, a Benedictine monk, who's writing most of his homilies right around the year 1000, right? Because I felt kind of the lack of tradition in a sense of like that you get in some Christian faiths. I mean, I want to say like our church is not Protestant, but it's very much in that rubble of Protestantism.
As far as the aesthetics
yeah.
and the cultures is far more similar to Protestantism. We have a very
Right.
high ecclesiology akin to Catholicism and Orthodoxy, but as far as like high church, low church like practices, we feel more Protestant in the LDS Church outside of the temple, pretty much, which is where most of our worship is outside of the temple anyway. So
yes. So, anyways, Edmund. Edmund the Martyr. Interestingly, there are a couple other famous Edmunds, I think, from the early medieval period. You got a couple more kings of England, really. Edmund, and then Edmund the First. Not that important. And then Edmund Ironside, who is cooler, right? But Edmund the Martyr he's not okay. He's actually interesting, and I think maybe this is not the best place to start. But he is English, but he's not English. Okay. I don't know how would you explain that, Sean? I guess.
I mean, English in the sense that he's from what we now know as England.
Mm-hmm.
Yet, what we know as England didn't quite exist yet.
Right.
So, kind of, he's one of the kings of a kind of a precursor kingdom to the United England, which wouldn't happen for at least another 2 or 3 generations, I think.
Right. Yeah. If we generally count Athelstan as the first king of the English or whatever. What is interesting, actually, because I was reading a book by Francis Young, and I'm going to look up the name of it strictly real quick. And one thing he says is interesting, actually, is the fact that the English decide to call themselves English, right? Because Athelstan comes from a Saxon house. He does not come from an English family. And he actually kind of speculates that some of it might have actually had to do with Edmund, who is an Angle, right? Like he is the Angli part of that, Anglo-Saxon, right? He was the king of East Anglia. And so I think it's interesting. I mean, I do think already... I mean, like Bede calls them the English people, right? Everyone in Britain that speaks Old English. In fact, the language is also called English. The English do not call it Saxon, even when they are Saxon speaking. But there seems to be like a positive like thing about the English label, and some of it seems to have, whether it is stemming from Edmund or whether it is also before him, like Bede, right, and stuff like that. English made more sense as a label. I mean, we have the story of Gregory the Great as well, which Shannon is probably not aware of, but but I think it's interesting though that you have Edmund, who is one of those saints that we don't actually have like really much known about him. Like there's what in part, I would say actually in large part, is because he was the king of East Anglia, and this is during the Great Heathen Army's time, and so presumably much of that was burnt, pillaged, scattered to the wind, right?
Much like the Saxons, they would have had all sorts of records, charters that just absolutely destroyed by the Viking raids,
which is really depressing. So because of that, we don't actually have much information on Edmund's life, like proper, right? Really, the only thing we have is like we have a guess on when around he became king, and then we know when he died, and essentially that is like the story of Edmund is actually his martyrdom, essentially.
Yeah, one of the few kind of records we do have of him existing even are coins.
Yeah.
Anything more delicate was long gone, long destroyed.
Yeah. which is interesting, actually. In fact, I've heard about the coins specifically that early in his reign, the coins they find are pretty pure silver. But at some point, when the Great Heathen Army shows up, it seems like that is when the silver quality dropped in the East Anglian coins. Obviously, because of the Great Heathen Army. Now, how exactly that worked, right? Like, were these crappy coins like the ones they were giving to the Danes, right? Like, or what? Like, not entirely sure. You know what I mean? But like, obviously, you can see that in the archaeological record that happens. What's also cool about his coins is that he has the name not just Rex, but the Rex normally it's just A. So like Rex Anglorum, right? Like King of the Angles, essentially, which is not actually a title I believe his predecessor used, like on his coinage, which just used Rex. So there has been speculation that Edmund was probably of the house of the Woofings, like the earlier East Anglian kings, though I don't think that is ever confirmed, again, because we don't have like any records.
Yeah, not confirmed, but that's a very popular hypothesis based on the coin finds.
Yeah, and also
really,
the wolf that shows up in his martyrdom, I think, actually kind of seems to be a motif that makes sense if he is of that house.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, maybe I should just add as well that you guys are getting really good into the nitty gritty. But for those that don't know, Edmund the Martyr was king of East Anglia, as they said. During this period, we know a lot of what we think. I say we know these things about these people during the length of their ranks because of their coinage. Often we know Oswald, his successor, a little bit from his coinage as well, and before him would have been Ethelweard from his coinage. So, but none of them are nearly as famous as Edmund. Edmund was probably pretty young. I mean, he reigned. Okay, so he was king of East Anglia. We're not exactly sure when he was born, but we believe his reign was from 855 to about 869. And his feast day would
have been probably about 30 or so when he was martyred.
Yeah, that would be a fair assessment. I guess we just don't know for certain. But either way, and there is, like they said, relatively few historical facts about him. But he was a very popular saint. I mean, we still talk about him today because he's had different cult followings pretty much throughout since his martyrdom. And there's been like a lot of weird. I mean, there's even been some followings that lasted a couple centuries in like France, from what I read. So he's been a pretty influential saint, but he's mostly associated with where he's from, and that is, England, right? Or even if it wasn't necessarily England when he was there at this point in the Middle Ages, right? So.
Right. He actually is, and probably, there are several saints that are can get the label of patron saint of England. Gregory the Great, probably the first one, right? Right, because he specifically says, "Go and convert to the English," right? And sets up that see in Canterbury, right? But he never went to England, right? Or what is England? And you also have some other patron saints. George is the latest one, right? Thomas Becket is one of sort. Edward the Confessor is one. Really, the biggest one up until St. George really took all the fame in a sense, right? It is Edmund. Like Edmund, for some reason, is the saint essentially, right? He is venerated by pretty much everyone, right? Like as a sign of kingship, right? From the Anglo-Saxons to the Danes to the Normans, right? I mean, he is venerated by a lot of people, and in fact, he was particularly considered to be a royal saint, right? Like the patron of the kings of England, not just England itself.
Absolutely.
Up until the dissolution of the monasteries, which is a huge mess. I don't even know how to describe it without getting very upset with the whole idea. But essentially, in fact, Francis Young, again, the name of the book, actually, by the way, is Edmund in Search of England's Lost King. It's from 2018 or so. He says that Edmund essentially defines Englishness as that patron, like St. Patrick does for Irishness.
Yeah, I can definitely see that to be true. I mean, up through the Middle Ages, even when St. George started to gain popularity, Edmund was still kind of near the top for quite a long time. Um, so yeah, his cult was kind of slow to wane as St. George was rising.
Right, because St. George is like what, 14th century, I think, because when, I don't remember who it is, Edward III, kind of like takes on St. George as a patron. Um, but yeah, even then, he's still the royal saint up until the Protestant Revolution, if you will. Um,
Yeah,
so
St. George started to gain popularity during the Third Crusade. Richard Richard the Lionheart, before one of his battles, he actually prayed at the tomb of St. George and won the battle the next day. So
Mm.
he took St. George as his personal patron saint. Not the
yeah,
saint of the country, but it's his personal patron saint that he was devoted to. And because of that, because the new king chose St. George, that's how George started to gain popularity. It kind of caught on.
yeah,
More people started praying to St. George, venerating him. Um,
right. I think when you mentioned Richard the First, the Lionheart, right? Like, what's interesting though is that the guy famous for not really ever going to England or like going to England very little. When he did, he actually went to the shrine of Saint Edmund, right?
yes,
And he prayed for his English soldiers, right?
yes.
Which is very cool, right? And to know, right? Because I didn't know that until I was looking stuff up about this, right? I think Richard the Lionheart is a very awesome figure, but not one I associate very strictly with Englishness in a lot of ways.
Oh yeah, he's very not English in many respects.
Right. He's Aquitanian in a lot of ways. He's
Mm-hmm.
Angevin, right? So yeah. But I do think Edmund. I guess actually we probably should talk about that martyrdom. But
Yeah, that'd be a good place to
before
go.
we get too far into this, Edmund is an interesting character because he's not like those very earliest saints, right? The professors and martyrs, right? Martyr is coming from a Greek word that essentially just means witness, right? And so like you profess Christ. In the case of the Roman Empire, you essentially need to make an offering to the emperor at least, and if you refuse, essentially the idea is they're going to kill you, right? But of course, if you're a Christian, you will take no other god, like you will not accept that, right? And so that's how we get a lot of our early martyrs, not completely, right? Because there's heavy persecution in certain eras, right? But when you move a little further like in time and move to the medieval period, a lot of these martyrs are just kings, at least in England's case, and maybe not even a lot, but some of these martyrs are just kings essentially, and they die in battle against pagans, right? I mean, you actually have this mostly, I would say, in early Anglo-Saxon history, more so than say like Edmund's time, right? Because I think you have
Yeah, I mean, earlier
Edwin,
on, you have a lot more.
yeah,
There's a lot more pagans that still exist, and so there's a lot more conflict
right.
between Christians and pagans. Where most have been Christianized, if not all, by Edmund's time within England.
Right, yeah, right. Because I mean, I think you had Pinda, he was the big bad boogeyman there for a while, and he killed a
Yes.
few kings, and they essentially get declared martyrs. In fact, the most important one, I would say, as far as Edmund is concerned, is that you have Sigebert, who is an earlier king of East Anglia, and so likely an ancestor of Edmund's, who I think his father's Radwald, actually, the guy that is presumed believed to be buried in the Sutton Hoo burial. And Radwald is like not a very pious Christian, if you will. Like I think Bede says that, for example, he let his wife keep the pagan altars with the Christian ones. If I'm remembering correctly, but Sigebert is very pious. In fact, he seemingly was in exile, maybe because he was like a bastard son of his father, until he was needed, right? Until the king died, and they're like, oh, well, we need someone, right? This guy, he's in France, or France doesn't really exist at the time. He's in Francia, right? He's in this monastery, and he comes back, and he is a very like pious ruler. In fact, he sets up the kingdom essentially, installs like a co-king, and then retires to a monastery. What's interesting is which monastery that is, but we'll talk about that in a second. And essentially when Mercia declares war, they're like, hey, we need the king to lead the battle. And it's like, okay, whatever. And the legend goes, he was so convicted of his like Christian ideals that he goes into battle without a blade and just a staff, and he dies in battle, right? And so he is also canonized. actually, before the thing that was important is the Sigebert's reign has the first see established in East Anglia, in a place that we don't even know where it is anymore. Maybe it's sunk into the sea. Who knows? And there's also that Sigebert himself establishes a monastery, presumably is the one I believe that he would have lived in. And that monastery is actually what would be like the predecessor monastery to Bury St. Edmunds. It is Bealdrichesworth Monastery. But one thing I want to talk about real quick, actually, and so Sean, I think you're probably good for this. But canonizing saints, how is the process of that? Like, what makes someone a saint? Like by popular demand or what?
I mean, in this period, I think a lot of it comes from popular demand. Someone well-known, pious, or martyred dies. People recognize their holy life or deeds, their martyrdom. Start praying for the intercession. There could be miracles associated with the body. It could be an incorrupt body, meaning it hasn't decomposed. It's been kind of whole. A lot of miracles potentially happen to the intercessions. You hear things about maybe saints even floating or glowing or things happening like that. So there's a lot of things that could make people believe in this person's kind of sainthood. And then eventually that kind of works up the hierarchy of the church. The bishop will come and investigate, and eventually this person may be declared a saint. And not that the church makes someone a saint. This person is already a saint. But the church is merely recognizing that, yes, we're sure this person is a saint. So they're a saint whether the church says so or not. But the church is just formally recognizing this person as such.
Okay. Yeah, so that's interesting. Especially since it seems like Edmund probably there must have been a continuum, right? He must have been pretty popular immediately, I would guess, right? But immediately he is in a conquered kingdom, right? I mean, like, and so it's interesting that seemingly actually the Danes and the locals that still would have been around, of course, are the first. In fact, we even have that Bury St. Edmunds essentially is established by King Canute, even though there's already a previous abbey there. They do build a very, very grand abbey. I believe it would have been, I think, one of the biggest churches in England actually at the time. That would have been Romanesque style. But that is, of course, destroyed in the dissolution of the monasteries. I hear the ruins actually of the abbey are actually just a public park now, so which is very interesting. But I know we said we would get into it, and I know I'm directing, but Shannon, what is the story of what is his martyrdom story? Do you have that?
So I can at least give you the bare bones idea of it, and that is essentially, as the Great Heathen Army is coming in to East Anglia, I think at that point, Viking raids had been happening, right? But they hadn't overwintered. But at this point, they're going to overwinter, and then they're going to take more. They're going to be taking more land and more loot than they had previously, and that includes, facing down the king of East Anglia, Edmund, and they're going to win. The Viking forces are going to win, and they are going to torture Edmund. At least this is the hagiography that is attested to Edmund. They're going to torture Edmund, and of course at this time the Great Heathen Army, these are pagans. I think this has been made pretty well known through some popular media, like TV shows and stuff like that, that the Northern Germanics, the Scandinavians were pagan a bit longer than lots of European groups were. And so they're going to torture Edmund, trying to get him to deny the Christ, pretty much, deny Christ. And he refuses to do so. And so part of this torture, at least in the depictions, seem to be they're going to riddle him full of arrows. One of the symbols of Edmund is the arrow. Another one is the sword. Lots of the depictions of him with arrows are reminiscent of depictions of Saint Sebastian, who was a Roman saint that was riddled with arrows. I say Roman as in he was a Roman citizen. And then, so, a few hundred years before this, but Saint Edmund was riddled with arrows, and that didn't kill him, it seems, just like it didn't kill Sebastian. So they had to go to alternative means. and they lob off his head with a sword. And so hence why the sword is also a symbol. And the other symbol Leah mentioned briefly actually was the wolf, which might have something to do with his lineage, or what's attested there. But that's pretty much the story of Saint Edmund. Is he was a martyr. Saint Edmund the Martyr is because he was tortured and killed for not denying Christ. Now, of course, there's the political aspect in the sense, well, he's also the king. He's the ruler of this people that are being conquered. But it sounds like he was at least admired by his people and was admirable as a king because he'd fulfilled his duty in his faith, at least his religious duty, right, for the time as well. And I mean, being martyred, it never sounds like appealing, right? I don't think most people today, especially in our like cushy Western civilization, are very acquainted with the idea of being killed for your faith. That still happens in some parts of the world, unfortunately. But it's something that, even if it is relatively more common during your era, like during the era that Saint Edmund lived in, it's still an admirable thing, right? It doesn't mean it was easy, even if it's more common. So I think that Edmund seems to have been a faithful guy, right? And he met an untimely end because his people were attacked by people of a different faith tradition that didn't agree with his, at least. Did I get it right? Did I do okay, guys?
Yeah, I think you pointed it out too. I mean, he was an adversary to the Vikings, the Great Heathen Army, both religiously and politically.
Mm-hmm.
He was a barrier to their conquest, but yeah, he was a symbol of the enemy faith.
Right, and seemingly he was looking out for his people because the account's a little like hazy on like why exactly they killed him, right? I mean, because it seems like I will not subject myself to anyone but Christ. Like, seems to be pretty key in it, right? But like in a lot of ways, like why kill him? And I mean, because maybe it seems like there was a fight. Either way, it seems like Edmund was trying to do what was best for his kingdom and for his people, right? In fact, when the Great Heathen Army shows up in England, or what will become England proper, right? They show up in East Anglia, actually. And assumably, Edmund pays them off, which is pretty normal at the time. And they go up into Northumbria and they take York. When it's later that they end up coming back on the horses that Edmund probably gave them, because that's another thing, part of the deal. Edmund says, "Don't like hurt my people," essentially, and I'll give you some horses, right, and stuff. And then they come back, and what the accounts tell us is that they kill Edmund, right? But it doesn't really give us really much more details than that. What is interesting actually is that the main source is a Passio written by Abo of Fleury, which Abo is probably like some, well, it is a Germanic name, like a shortening version of it, like the pet version of it. Like Athelbach, I think would be the Old English version. Anyways, that's neither here nor there. And Abo supposedly actually heard the story itself from Dunstan, who was another saint. While Dunstan was alive, Dunstan was actually, it would have been like a year or two before Dunstan dies himself. So Dunstan's rather old. And Dunstan says that years ago, he heard from a very old retainer of Edmund's the story, right? And so, yeah, like Shannon said, they'd lob off his head. The story from there pretty much goes that a wolf comes and, it protects the head, right, from any other beasts. And when the people are looking for his head to give him a proper Christian burial, someone calls out, "Where are you, friend?" And he hears, in Abo, it's hik, 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 which is her, which is here, of course. Alfred translates this into English very shortly after Abo puts it into Latin. And they are able to find Edmund's head, which is speaking, right? You know what I mean? Like, which is a pretty common motif, actually, in like Norse and Celtic stories. Kind of rare that it shows up in an English story here. But supposedly they're able to take his head and they put it back with the body, and it like reattaches itself, essentially, with like a red line, pretty much to mark what had happened. And it's a pretty interesting story, right? I mean, like, to be completely honest, I could see why that would increase the faith of the people around there, right? And also, as far as like sources go, while that is some time between his death, right, in the 9th century to I think it's a little over 100 years later when this Passio is written down, it's also not like a great amount of time, and that's also a pretty clean like line of like accounting, right? You know what I mean? It's like
Mm-hmm.
Abbo, Dunstan, the one retainer, right? Like that's pretty clean, really, as far as a lot of these things go.
Yeah, that's actually really good compared to lots of other things that we believe historically, right? Because lots of other things that we even believe that we take for granted as just being true because we teach it in school don't even have as good of a attestation, unbroken line like that, so close with like a witness, like an eyewitness, pretty much. So for how old
Right.
it is,
Yes, you were right.
Thank you.
I know at least as far as I can't remember when he was translated. I don't know if either of you remember. He was supposedly buried near where he was killed, and then still in the Anglo-Saxon period, he's translated. His body is taken to Bury St. Edmunds, right? And I don't know if that was during Canute's time. I can't remember. Right. But
Yeah, I don't remember the exact years of that, but it was probably right around the time of Canute.
right. What's interesting is Canute is a Dane,
Mm-hmm.
right? In fact, Edmund is accredited with with killing Canute's father as dead, right, as a saint. Actually, and Canute, I believe, killed another Edmund Ironside, if I remember correctly, or at least defeats him. Yeah, it's like shortly. That's the interesting thing to me. Like you have Richard the First, right? You have all these other kings, Norman kings. But not just the Normans, right? You have, you had, you had William I, Richard I. So even William Conqueror went to Edmund's tomb, right? Edward I, Richard II, Henry VI, right? But even Canute, who's a Dane, and he is establishing, I am the king. And in reality, he was the king of the English before he was the king of the Danes and Norwegians. And he's like, I'm English, right? Like I will go to Edmund's shrine, right? Like, and so like very early on, Edmund is the English saint, essentially, right? Like that his having him as a patron, like includes you as kind of like participating in whatever the English saint is, right? In a sense.
Yeah, I think it definitely could give a more legitimate claim to Canute. I mean, yeah, he's clearly a foreigner. The English people would see that, and I think you see it a lot throughout history is foreign rulers or even foreign consorts try to do things to make themselves look more like the nationality they're living with now. So he's trying to make himself look more English to
Right.
perhaps appease the English people more and make them accept him as king when he's clearly Danish.
Right.
Canute
Yeah.
is the most English name I can think of. No, well, and if anything, it's really interesting just because, obviously there's some political motivation, right, for Canute doing that, but just the fact that it's so recognizable that Edmund is like the guy, the saint that you want to visit his tomb and stuff like that, or in his relics, shows that just how influential he was. And I know we've mentioned again that just like he is kind of the guy through lots of English history. I'm not sure he actually is the guy in many ways anymore, just because St. George, right? But I imagine he's still got some sort of national sway. I don't know too much about the Anglican and like Catholic communities in England and whatnot.
Yeah, there have been a few kind of modern movements to reinstate him as the official patron saint of England. None of them have gone terribly far, but there have been people trying to do that. And I think it's hard because I think at this point in time, St. George has been the patron saint of England so long.
Right.
I mean, St. George has become English in a way.
Right.
He's part of the English national identity at this point. I mean, their flag is the St. George's cross. St. George killing the dragon is on national symbols everywhere.
Right.
Or we don't see Edmund in a similar place at the moment.
Should have got an English person on here to give us their thoughts. I always like the idea of, I mean, because George is a great saint as well, and we might talk about George in another episode. But like he's not English in a lot of ways, right? He's just literally not from England, right? but Edmund seems to be that first national one, because England does not have a scarcity of saints. Right, not even close, right? And like, there's a ton. Sean sent us a whole list, right? There's a ton of English saints, but Edmund seems to stand above them, above almost all of them, actually, quite a bit, right? I mean, you have other ones, but even then, most of them are regional. Like Cuthbert's great, but he's mostly a Northumbrian guy, right? So yeah, it's very interesting. I wonder how the identity part of it. I mean, because you definitely, like I said, we mentioned earlier, the dissolution of monasteries. That wonderful Henry guy, he absolutely just raises Bury St. Edmunds, pretty much, the abbey there, it even though he was the royal saint, like that was the royal cult, which is weird in a lot of ways, right? Because they didn't do that to others. In fact. Notably, Edward the Confessor did not get that same treatment. And Shannon, you mentioned earlier, actually, the idea is that potentially his body escaped to Toulouse, of all places, though it would have supposedly happened before then. I believe that came out and turned out that's probably not true. What is probably more likely is that his body was relocated in Bury St. Edmunds and probably buried somewhere else. But they haven't found it. As far as I'm aware, that is the most recent speculation. That he was probably buried under where a tennis court is or something, right? Like, but as far as I'm aware, they still haven't found his body. So, but yeah, he is one of those saints that did have that, like Sean mentioned, that he was considered incorrupt. I believe the last test was in the 12th century, so it's been a while, right? But he was determined to be incorrupt, and that's obviously a sign of saintliness. It's interesting that he actually has that incorrupt aspect to him, even though he's a martyr. Because a lot of martyrs don't, right? A lot of those incorrupt saints are like founders of monasteries, right? That don't die in battle, right, or whatever, right? And so that is interesting. Also, that shows up in his family, though. There's several people in his family. Most of them are women, but even like Sigebert, right? They're considered incorrupt, and that is part of the reason why they are venerated. But I definitely think Edmund is like one of the coolest saints to start with, because he's just. That's like such an interesting period in history. He's got such he has his veneration, like his story, first off, is really interesting and very faith building in my mind. And also that's he's got such a prestigious history as a saint. And it's kind of actually sad how little he seems to have now, but I live in America and I've never been to England, but but yeah, it's definitely and actually, one of my first thoughts on him actually is Shannon will know what I'm talking about. I don't know about you, Sean, but art, the Wilton diptych. Okay, and I don't even remember who the king is. I don't even know who the king is. I know you can recognize the Virgin Mary. You can recognize John. You can recognize Edward the Confessor, and you can recognize Edmund the Martyr.
Yes,
right.
That's a beautiful piece of art.
And okay. So Wilton diptych, I always call it diptych. Yeah. That's what we call it. I taught art history for 1 year, so art's a little bit up my alley. And I would teach this piece just a little bit in my class. I mostly show it because I think it's a beautiful example of international Gothic, especially international Gothic style in England, when it was pretty prevalent. It's like they're into the 14th century, which is kind of when international Gothic becomes pretty popular. It goes into the beginning of the 15th century, but it's not like a very long-lasting stylistic trend, but very heavy on the detail and like the textures, and it's beautiful. And if I'm being honest, I feel like the person they gave the most attention to is Edmund the Martyr, just from looking at it. But what's interesting too is because it has Richard II, who is I believe the successor to Edward III, who's the one that is going to make the St. George Cross a bit more popular in England. St. George's flag is in the Wilton diptych, but St. George is not. So they put his flag in there. I guess it's kind of becoming more popular symbol of England, but maybe but they still have soft spots for all these other guys, because John the Baptist, and then Edward the Confessor, and Edmund the Martyr. And Edmund the Martyr, like I said, like his robe in the painting, the tempera, is just immaculate. Like, it's so lovely. Not to discredit any of the rest of the piece. I mean, even, you know, Mary and the Christ child, but Mary kind of blends in like with the angels, to be honest. And it's one of the angels that's holding St. George's flag. And then it's on the other panel that we get the king and then the three saints next to him. I'm curious, if anything, why St. John the Baptist is in it. I mean, we know John the Baptist, obviously super important for Christians pretty much everywhere, but I'm curious in many ways why, of all the ones they put in there, because they put pretty nationalistic representations with the flag of St. George, but then of course Edward the Confessor and Edmund Martyr are also relatively national figures, saints with England. I'm not sure about St. John the Baptist, but Edmund the Martyr has his arrow there, but his gown or robe or whatever you want to call it is worth staring at and making into a wallpaper. But so I don't know if they just, and that's just kind of typical of the style, the International Gothic style, but just compare it to like anybody else's gown in the image, and it seems like maybe they did like Edmund the Martyr a little bit more. The only exception maybe is Richard II's gown is pretty good too. But yeah.
His gown really blends in with the background though. Edmund the Martyr's does not so much. It's very, very beautiful. I looked it up real quick, and I don't know why this is, but Richard II's patron is John the Baptist.
Oh, okay.
Which is why he included him in there. I don't know why, but that is why it's in there. So, but yeah, I don't really have much else to say. I do think this is, again, a great first saint to talk about. I'm glad we're doing this. And I think Edmund is someone worth studying. If you want to study the Passio in Latin, you want to study Alfred's homily on Edmund, his Lives of Saints, or just read some modern translation of it. I think it's definitely worth your time. It's not super long, yeah, that's from me at least.
Yeah, we've been talking a little over 40 minutes for a saint that we don't really have any written records of his actual life during his time, yet we've been able to pull out so much information in just this short period of time. I think with a little more digging, I mean, you can see that this whole book's written on him. So I think there's definitely a lot more to learn and know about St. Edmund than we can even cover in a show like this.
Right, certainly, and maybe at some point we'll write a book on Edmund. Maybe at some point we'll go a little bit more in detail. I wouldn't mind revisiting some people at some point. We're planning on doing the show for a while, but either way, yeah, Edmund is, despite having very little like historical idea of historical facts about Edmund, there's a really strong presence of the historical idea of Edmund, because he seems to be very influential beyond his sphere, or very highly venerated. And his story, I think, is a pretty miraculous one. So perhaps, rightly so venerated, right? But at the same time, there's a lot of intricacy with it that perhaps those books do justice for. But either way, I think that we can all learn from St. Edmund. As with pretty much, I think actually in many ways, we can learn from most anybody, even if lots of the people we run into, it's what not to do. I don't think that's the case here for St. Edmund the Martyr, though, and that is simply do what is best for your people, right? And it's one thing to recognize that, political safety is important, hence why he might have given them horses at the time, at the time, which may have come around and, been a disadvantage in the future when they are conquered. But like just the political necessity of your people and these things that help them in their day-to-day lives is okay, right? And he seemed to have been mindful of that, but he also seemed to have been mindful of their spiritual well-being and their eternal outcome, and that's even more compelling for a leader. I wish more of our political figures were like that. Then most of them don't seem to be anything close to that. So I wish we should bring St. Edmund the Martyr back and he could be our president or something. But
yeah, that'd be great, huh?
Be cool. But it would be great as well. But is there anything else you guys want to add?
If I could maybe just if we could close with this little quote from the beginning of the homily on St. Edmund. I'll just read Eleanor Parker's translation, just the opening part of it. So I didn't translate it myself. Hey, Edmund the Blessed, King of the East Angles, was wise and honorable, and always honored Almighty God in noble conduct. He was humble and virtuous, and endured so resolutely that he would never submit to shameful vices, nor on either side deviate from his virtuous practices, but was always mindful of the true teaching. Have you been appointed as a ruler? Do not exalt yourself, but be among men as if you were one of them. He was generous to the poor, and like a father to widows, and with benevolence always guided his people to righteousness, and restrained the violent, and blessedly lived in the true faith.
Amen. Okay. Well, that was actually really nice. But that's been Saints and Sages for episode 1. Hopefully the other episodes will run even smoother than this has, because this has obviously been super smooth. We're professionals at it, but either way, we appreciate anyone who's listened, especially if you've listened up to this point, and we will see you guys hopefully at least on a monthly basis. You should hear from us, and we don't want to spoil who we're going to talk about next month, but expect a video or a listen in January for the new year. But hope you guys all have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year as well as we get into the festive end of the season. And have a good St. Edmund the Martyr feast day, which is today. So. Bye.
Adios.